Dan walked quietly down the street, sticking to the middle lines that were once used to separate traffic. Walking the lines of a street like they were a tightrope was an old habit from his childhood. It was dark out, and he guessed it might be past midnight at this point. The moon was just a small sliver of white in the sky, not enough to illuminate anything significantly for him. As he walked, he didn't pass many cars, and the ones he did pass were old, broken down, and looted. The houses on either side of him, he assumed, had their own residents already. Something or other had probably slid its way inside through the broken front doors or windows, and the last thing Dan needed was to come face to face with them while looking for shelter. He passed another car to his right. In the dark, he could barely make out the shape of something car-like. A flat area for the hood, then another higher up that would be a roof. As he walked past, he watched it. Nothing moved. It seemed like the car was... It shook. Dan stopped. His breaths became shallow as he crouched down, trying to blend into the darkness of the street. He'd learned early on into the invasion that dark colors were very useful. Now he was dressed in all blacks and dark blues. He'd even stained his arms and legs black, where the skin shone through with some old Sharpies he'd soaked in a bucket of water. The car shook again, and Dan heard the crunching of metal. His eyes darted down suddenly as he remembered the stripes on the road. Slowly, Dan started creeping to his left, his eyes moving between the yellow stripes he'd been walking on and the car. He'd be visible if he laid on those, a black silhouette of lunch. He stepped off them and crouched down again in as close to a half-runner stance as he could. If he needed to run, he would, and he'd have to remember to avoid the street lines. The car shook again, and there was a sound like fabric being torn before another loud crunch of metal. Whatever was inside had torn through the floor and was now sliding out under the car. Dan could see a vague snake-like shape rising above the car, towering over the car by at least 6 feet. The thing swayed left and right. Dan had seen the snake ones do this before. He didn't know why they did it, but he knew it meant they had recently eaten. Dan could feel a cold sweat run down the side of his head and cheek. He almost wiped it unconsciously, but stopped himself. Moving now might mean death. The snake ones were fast, he knew. He'd seen them catch up to a deer before. This one had eaten recently, though, and maybe that would slow it down, or make it less motivated to hunt him down. Either way, for now, he wouldn't move. The snake thing stopped moving. It sat still for just a moment before suddenly dashing under the car. Dan breathed in slowly and quietly. His eyes searched for the snake under the car, but it was too dark, and the angle was too obscured. For now, he sat still waiting. Not under the car, but crossing what used to be a lawn some time ago, but now was just dirt and dead grass next to the car. A shape on what was at least 4 legs, Dan couldn't tell if there were more, lunged forward and smashed into the car, sending it flying. Dan jumped at the sudden movement and crashing, but nothing noticed him. The snake was too busy fighting for its life against this new thing. Dan could hear screeching and squealing noises coming from one or both of the creatures. Some kind of hissing noise and an almost human scream followed as the two shapes became one blob of shadow in the darkness. Dan saw his opportunity and ran. He sprinted down the street behind him, listening to the sounds of the two creatures struggling with one another, just as he got to a T intersection and he didn't know whether to go right or left, but the sounds behind him stopped. Dan ran right, turning his head trying to see the creatures again. They were too far, and it was too dark. But there was a new sound. A sickening crunching and tearing sound. One was eating the other. It must have been the new thing chewing. Dan knew the snake things ate their food whole. That thing back there was fast, and if it came for him next, he'd better have a hell of a good start. Most of the things he'd encounter could smell. He figured that's how it found the snake thing. He blindly ran faster down the new street, trying to take in his surroundings. To his left, there was some kind of hill. He couldn't tell if it was concrete or natural. Maybe it was an exit ramp or something like that. To his right, there were backyards of old suburban houses. The majority of them had fences. He turned and sprinted into the only unfenced backyard he could see. The dried grass crunched under his feet as he ran for the back door. Something crashed down the road behind him. It sounded like a big rock. He turned the doorknob, pushing his way inside. There was a skittering across the floor somewhere to his right, and he turned just as something made of a viscous black liquid ran out of the room. Whatever it was had taken the form of a cockroach the size of his chest. The house had been overturned, either by looters or by other things. All of the furniture was out of place and only a couple of pieces were still on their feet. Most were upside down or on their sides. Something crashed outside in the backyard. Dan was running out of time. He hurried to the kitchen sink at his right and flung the cabinets underneath open. He scanned the contents and found what he'd been looking for, a white jug with a big blue cap. He took the bleach, unscrewed the cap, and held it above his head. He shut his eyes tight and held his nose with his other hand as he poured it over himself. It burned as it flowed through his hair and down his face and body. Something crashed into the back door. Dan wiped his face with his hand and quickly moved into the next room. There was another crash at the back door. This time the hinges gave way and the door was flung onto the floor. Dan found himself in a dining room. A large wooden table was pressed against the wall on its side, its legs sticking out into the room. Several chairs were toppled over in the middle of the room, and a few pictures on the wall had fallen down, leaving shards of glass scattered across the floor. Dan ran for the table, scooting it off the wall and ducking behind it, just as the thing crashed through the wall next to him. Dust from the drywall and insulation filled the room as the thing stopped to search for its prey. Dan huddled behind the table. He'd cover his scent with the bleach, and he hoped that would be enough. The thing seemed to be smelling, but Dan couldn't exactly tell. The thing didn't sniff the air like any animal Dan knew. From what he could tell from behind the table, it was just standing there and taking in scents somehow. The bleach was really burning his skin now. It felt like needles poking through him. Each drop made its own indentation into his flesh as it burned through like acid. He'd made a mistake with the bleach. The pain was getting unbearable. He'd have to do something soon. He'd have to make a move and try to escape. A crunch of glass got Dan's attention. The thing was moving now. Another crunch, closer this time. Dan stopped breathing out of instinct. His ears perked up and his body felt like it was on full alert. He'd had close calls, but this was closer than he'd ever been, and it wasn't over yet. There was another crunch, closer again, this time just on the other side of the table. One thought crossed Dan's mind as he stared up at the ceiling through the gap he'd huddled himself into. It knows. There was a scrape against the bottom of the table, the side opposite Dan, and he made a decision. Moving his legs up to his chest and putting his feet flat against the top of the table, he kicked it hard. The table flew forward and caught the thing off guard as it made a sort of squealing noise. Dan burst up onto his feet and darted for the next room. The dining room had no doors on either entrance, so he could see the next room was a living room, and living rooms had front doors. The thing recovered faster than Dan thought it would, and lashed out at him. Something thin and slimy grabbed him around his waist. It wrapped itself around him several times and started to pull him back. He fought, kicking and squirming and swinging his arms to pull himself free. He screamed harder than he'd ever screamed in his life. It ripped through the noises of their struggle and swallowed every sound around it. He screamed a scream of sheer terror as any sense of thought left his mind. His lungs burned and his throat seared. The thing was too strong. He couldn't get free of it. Slowly, he was being dragged backwards. He lunged forward, trying to grab the frame of the doorway. He missed by at least a foot and landed on his stomach, knocking the wind out of his chest and silencing his screaming. He was still being dragged, and now shards of glass were biting into him. As he was pulled over them, the bleach burned as it came into contact with the cuts. He could feel trickles of blood and bleach running into his clothes. He grabbed at the chairs as he passed by them and got a good hold on one. As he neared the thing, he swung the wooden chair as hard as he could. There was no effect. The thing took the hit and opened its mouth. It gaped open, and as the lower half of Dan entered, still kicking at the teeth and tongue, his upper body still squirming and hitting at the thing, it bit down. There was an ungodly squish of flesh and blood, and a crunch as it bit through his spine. Dan's body went cold as the creature crunched on his lower half. He was conscious for less than a minute. His struggling was over. The fight was done. He slipped into cold bliss. This has been Being Hunted, a story by Grayska Voice, voiced by Grayska Voice. Like and subscribe for more.